I'm Gwendolyn Zohara Simmons, a founding member of the National Council of Elders and a member of the King and Breaking Silence Planning Committee. And I was blessed to know and work with Dr. King during the civil rights years as staff of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We're going to move right into asking you, Rashid, to please give us a synopsis of the 100 Years War on Palestine up to where we are now. And as you often do in your talks, please mention your own family's involvement with the early Zionist settler project. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahara, for that introduction. And thanks to everybody who's taking part in this event and to those who organized it. I think it's really important that there be this focus on Palestine. This is a world historical moment. What we're seeing is a genocide developing before our very eyes. And I'm sad, but the book I wrote 4 years ago terribly encapsulates it. This is a war on Palestine. It is not a Israel-Hamas war. It's a war on Palestine. And the argument of the book is that this has always been what it was and what it is. It's a war on Palestine, not just by the Zionist movement early on in the state of Israel, more recently, but by great imperial powers, Britain in the first instance, and now the United States. They were and are both at war with the Palestinian people. Without them, nothing that we're seeing could have happened or could be happening. You can see that from today's news. No vetoes, no tank and artillery ammunition, no F-35s, F-16s, F-15s, and there would be no war, very simply put. And one can go back to the mandate period, one can go back to the Balfour Declaration, and that's what I try and do in the book. I argue that it is not an age-old conflict. What we're seeing is a function of modern nationalism, function of modern imperialism. Before you had Arab nationalism, before you had Zionism, before you had these national movements, in other words, there was no real conflict in Palestine, certainly not between Arabs and Jews. And without the British and the United States and other great powers, you would not have had the developments that you've had since 1917. So that's the basic thesis of the book. I argue in the book that Zionism is both a national movement and a settler colonial project. Just like the United States, this is a settler colonial project, successful one, but it's also a national project. This is a nation state now. There's an Israeli people. But the Israeli project starts and continues as a settler colonial project. And one of the interesting things is none of the early Zionist leaders had any compunction about saying that openly. It was understood.
Moving on to you, Jeff, please pick up on Rashid's analysis that he touched on of Zionist settler colonialism and tell us why it indicates that the establishment of a single democratic state between the river and the sea is the only way to decolonize Israel.
Settler colonialism, in the sense of Zionism, means that a population arises, from a foreign population, and comes to a target country with the intention of taking it over. Every settler colonial movement invents a narrative about why that country belongs to them and not to the indigenous population. Often it has to do with God. We have a ready-made narrative in the Bible, of course. The Americans had manifest destiny. The French used the idea of civilization, civilizing the primitives. The Dutch Reformed Church said God intended South Africa to belong to the white man. Whatever the narrative is, it's a constructed narrative that is exclusive. It not only doesn't take into account indigenous rights or the existence of the indigenous population, it denies their existence, certainly as a national group, which is what Zionism has done until today. And this is not a conflict. That's where this becomes important. We always talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that implies somehow two sides, roughly symmetrical, that somehow got into a fight with each other. And now, they're in a conflict. And how do you get out of a conflict? Of course, you negotiate, you sit down, and you compromise. But settler colonialism is not a conflict. It's unilateral. The Zionist settlers came to Palestine with the intent of transforming an Arab country into a Jewish country, with the intent of transforming Palestine into the land of Israel and the state of Israel. There's no conflict here. It's unilateral. The Arabs, as we called them, were not even, they were maybe foils to what we did because they resisted, but they weren't part of the equation. It was completely us. It's our story, it's our narrative, and the Arabs had nothing to do with it. They could simply be displaced, ignored, denied until today. Of course, that's the case. And the Palestinians never, as Rashid said, Palestinians never got into a fight with the Jews. I mean, there was no, they resist until today, and resisted the invasion of their country by a settler colonial movement, of course. But that it wasn't, a conflict in which two sides get into a fight with each other is completely different from a colonial situation in which the indigenous population is defending itself and its lands and its patrimony against the intent of the invaders to come in and displace them and take their lands and take their country. So that's where settler colonialism becomes very important. And Zionism comes out of Eastern Europe. It comes out of the same ethno-nationalism that you see with Putin, that you see with Orban, that you see in Poland. The idea that a country belongs exclusively to one particular people. And like in those other countries, then, you get not only displacement and the taking of lands, but you get genocide. Settler colonialism really drives the future as well, because unlike a conflict, you can't resolve settler colonialism through negotiations. There's nothing really, Israel has nothing to negotiate with, and we see that. Netanyahu now is telling Biden no two-state, although there never was any two-state intention on the part of Israel. That goes against the entire purpose of Zionism. We're going to give up Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem to Arabs? What? And so the only way you end settler colonialism is through decolonization. We have to decolonize Zionism. In other words, dismantle the structures of domination and control. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is the Palestinians themselves have to determine what their national needs are. Certainly the return of the refugees is a key element of that. But what other parts, what about the land? What about their patrimony? In other words, the Palestinians have to also come in with the idea of what does liberation mean for us? And then with decolonization and the idea of liberation, then we have to come together, because both populations are going to remain in this country. We have to come together. And the only way out, in our opinion, I'm part of a group, again, called the One Democratic State Campaign, is the establishment of a single democracy over historic Palestine. Equal rights for everyone, one parliament, one set of laws, one citizenship. Everyone lives and works throughout the country. It's one country. We have to, in a sense, invent a new country.
Let's get to you, Ora. And of course, as an American Jew that was born and raised in Israel, you have much to share with us. And as the youngest member of our panel, we'd love for you to give us an overview of your transformation, given that you grew up in Jerusalem, you come from a religious family, your dad is a rabbi. how did you become an anti-occupation activist and an advocate for Palestinian rights? And also tell us about your current work.
First, I want to say that I do think it is really important for those of us who have managed to unlearn Zionism and extricate ourselves from the kind of cult of Zionism, It is really important for us to reflect on and share out our transformation. I know that I'm not alone in a lot of our unlearning and learning, being thanks to the patience and generosity of many Palestinian comrades. However, I also want to note that I think as much as it is important to establish Jewish opposition to Zionism, that this can't be done without a critical move that questions the sufficiency of a Jewish framework in terms of defining the ethics or the politics here. I think Judith Butler talks about this really well in Parting Ways, where she talks about even the critique of Zionism, if exclusively Jewish, extends Jewish hegemonic thinking over the region and becomes, in spite of itself, kind of part of the Zionist effect. So for me, as you said, as a American Jew born in Jerusalem and growing up here and there, back and forth, it has been really important for me to think of the work that I do in terms of reparations to some extent. My on one side of my family were Romanian and Lithuanian Jews who moved to Jerusalem in the early 1800s and were there for over 100 years and came here to escape the Ottoman draft, but were some of the first Jewish families to move outside the city walls of Jerusalem in what has now become West Jerusalem. So it's also profound for me to share space with you, Rashid and Jeff, given all of our different connections to Jerusalem, and hopefully transform the future of Jerusalem together. But it's been really important for me to, to, of course, liberate my own identity and my relationship to my heritage and my history from a narrowing Zionist stranglehold, but to do that in service of a global anti-imperialist and anti-colonial struggle. And so the work that I have focused on over the past 2.5 decades, since I got involved in the early 2000s in the original BDS student movement, has been about building crucial cross-movement connections with other communities who have vast experience surviving and resisting settler colonialism. One of the reasons why it's been so valuable to me to work with the National Council of Elders and the April 4th Coalition and Breaking the Silence is because I believe it is so important for us to learn what we can from the anti-apartheid and South Africa movements and from the movements to end Jim Crow and for Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty here in the United States. On a strategic level in terms of actually how have people been doing this, but also because what we have to do is counter the political ghettoization of Palestinians, especially in the United States. And as both Jeff and Rashid have referred to, the anti-colonial nature of this struggle and the core issues in terms of controlling land and natural resources and trade and all of that are completely obscured by the construction of this as a equal conflict, as was stated, but also as an identity-based issue, period. One of the reasons why I think it's so important for us to do this intergenerational building is to firmly establish the importance of those of us, especially in the US, engaging in the global Palestinian-led boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which has a deep intersectional approach. The aim is bringing together different struggles for racial and social and environmental and economic justice. And the work that we're doing is ensuring alliances that are built based on principled anti-racism and support for self-determination. And so I think that what we have to do is we have to connect the Palestinian struggle against Israeli apartheid with our local struggles against racism and repression and militarization. And we know that their systems are globalized. We know that Israeli and US and EU security forces and police forces train each other, not even to mention, of course, the massive arms trade that we've referenced. And we have to have our systems of resistance be equally globalized and intersectional, which is both because of what we believe in, right? That this is a principled stance against all forms of oppression and domination, and also because it's strategic in terms of strengthening the Palestinian struggle for liberation, as Jeff said, to not just say words like apartheid and settler colonialism, but really know what that means and be able to counter the way that, for instance, people, Israelis and American Jews have referred to the Hamas attacks as the biggest attacks on Jews since the Holocaust, which is such a dangerous and problematic framing, obviously, because it was an attack on colonizers. Whoever is colonizing them would be, whether they were Catholic or Hindu or Irish, which of course the Irish would never do. But that is what I think is important here. It is both principled and strategic for us to make sure that we are locating our work in this global anti-imperialist framework.